Very good. Welcome, everyone. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I coordinate the Forest Connect program. One of the activities of Forest Connect is a monthly webinar series. We've been running these since 2007, and we've had a variety of super interesting topics. Today is no different. We're going to be talking about an insect that has taken some of the eastern states by storm, and we're fortunate to have with us Cornell's Brian Eschnauer, who's going to be presenting. Brian's a senior extension associate. He works in the Integrated Pest Management Program. As a background in plant diagnostics, he focuses on insect and plant disease identification and then how to deal with those insect and diseases through sustainable pest management protocols. He currently emphasizes detection and control of new invasive pests. So that's a super important function. And I'm glad we have him at Cornell doing that. He's the one in Cornell that's providing statewide, maybe all of New York, providing statewide leadership for outreach on the invasive spotted lanternfly. For those of you who are interested in things aquatic, Brian enjoys boating and exploring waterways in New York. So if you have questions about that or have good places to go, you can send him a note and chat about waterways. So with that, Brian, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I'm looking forward to this. It's
Thank you, Peter.
I haven't heard an update on spotted lanternfly in at least a year, probably more than that. So I'm going to be all ears, and that's where I'm going right now. Turn off my mic and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Peter. We're going to start out really big picture with spotted lanternfly. So let's see here. Go to the first slide. This is what we're going to cover, so a lot of the background, just so everybody is kind of on the same page, and we'll really talk about, what kind of impacts we can see and what the latest research is telling us about the impact on forests. But I think it's important to hit all of these topics, and we'll go through them pretty quickly, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. So it is an invasive plant hopper. This photo I took on the right, I think it looks a little bit like a moth there, but it's important to recognize it's a plant hopper because of the way plant hoppers feed. It also has fly in its name, spotted lanternfly, but it's not a fly at all. It is native to Asia, and it feeds on 100 different plant species in the United States. And that number can certainly grow. If I was here talking to you about a year ago, maybe it would have been 50 or 75. We just keep finding new plants that it can feed on. So very wide host range, which makes it, an interesting pest to work with because it moves around in the landscape. Unlike many agricultural or tree pests that find their favorite host and stay there, this one moves around. It really likes the tree of heaven, that weedy species that we may be familiar with. It's also from its native habitat in Asia. So it has a special association with the tree of heaven. At one point, we thought it might be necessary for a spotted lanternfly to feed on the tree of heaven in order to complete its life cycle. We found it can reproduce without that feeding on Alanthus. However, if it has access to it, it does much better. And most spotted lanternfly, if a Alanthus tree is available, will find it at some point in its life cycle and feed on it. But it moves around. I've listed other plants that it likes there, other trees, black walnuts, willows, red maples, really can feed on all of the maples. We can talk about that. And underlying grapes, because especially late in the season, that's where it becomes a really important agricultural pest. But let's talk about where it came from. Over here in the blue is the native range for the spotted lanternfly. And in its native range, it's an insect that is difficult to find. It's there in very low numbers in the environment. And it's probably kept in check by natural predators there. But just like so many invasive species, when it's taken out of its native habitat, doesn't have those predators, the populations can explode. And that is what happened here in North America. It also happened, it's an invasive species in Korea. So we learned a little bit about this in South Korea before it hit in North America in Pennsylvania in 2014, Berks County, Pennsylvania. And that's above Philadelphia in this area of Pennsylvania. This is the latest calendar. We at the New York State ITM program are maintaining this national map for now. And this one was last updated in January. We have a couple updates that will take place in Maryland, but otherwise this is pretty accurate. Over the last few years, we have seen this western expansion. And you can see kind of a natural spread, if we want to call it that way, where there's a moving front that moved from its original site where it arrived to these other counties. And then you'll see a lot of jumps, and we can talk about how those may occur and how we might prevent those from happening as well. And I will mention that it is believed that it arrived on palletized stone that came from Asia, and it was probably either on the pallet or on the stone themselves as egg masses. The egg masses are very resilient and can survive transportation. We'll take a look at those too. But I got this from New York State Ag and Markets yesterday. So this is a current map of New York State. I work primarily for protecting our agriculture and our communities in New York State. So here it is. The most recent detection, and maybe the furthest north, is this in Rochester. And that was just Rochester, New York in the fall of last year, fall of 2023. And this provides kind of a heat map. So you can see where it is concentrated in New York City. If you visited New York City, you saw it there over the summer, the last 2 years. Also, Pittsburgh has a pretty good population. This one just shows New York State, so it doesn't show all of the infestations that are in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. How is it getting around? Well, it can move about 4 miles itself per year. Individual insects can fly further than that. So that's an average, especially if they catch a wind current. But it is an excellent hitchhiker. Can really move around with vehicles, cars, cargo, and any kind of human activity. I was in the Philadelphia area a couple of years ago, and there were a lot of spotted lanternfly just flying around. This one landed on the car in front of us. There you can see it. And there were a couple of light cycles before we got through at this intersection, and that spotted lanternfly was crawling around. Actually went into the crack between the trunk and the fender there. Did pop out, but they can even hold on to vehicles up to like 30 miles per hour, sometimes even greater if they're in like where the wipers are. So really something to inspect if you've been in an area that has spotted lanternfly and you're moving out of that area. It's important to inspect. And some states have quarantine areas like Pennsylvania, and they require anybody with a commercial vehicle that is leaving a quarantine area to inspect. Somebody at the operation has to be certified, and then they pass that training on to the employees that are moving the trucks around. Just a close-up view of that spotted lanternfly there. And we have had cases where they've gotten into the trunks, and somebody in New York State opens up a trunk after they've been in Pennsylvania, and there is a spotted lanternfly in there. So we're concerned about the adults moving around, but especially the eggs. So yeah, another reason not to move firewood, right? These egg masses are very resilient. It's believed that that's how it arrived in North America through the egg masses. They can survive sub-zero temperatures. And if they're on a log, for example, as pictured here, and that's moved to a portion of the country that does not have spotted lanternfly, those eggs can hatch in the springtime when the weather warms up, and you can have a new colony. The average number of eggs in an egg mass is about 35. We're particularly concerned about rail line corridors in New York State. The infestations in Buffalo, Syracuse, and Binghamton, New York, all were associated with rail lines and rail sidings where the boxcars sit. This is just a little video I took of a spotted lanternfly feeding on a tree there, and a train coming along. So you can get the picture. Also, in the background here, you'll see a lantus, one of its favorite host plants. So it's kind of a worst case scenario type of thing where the train can move the spotted lanternfly and you have its favorite host plant often nearby because, as you know, the tree of heaven fills in as one of those early species that comes into any cleared area. I want to talk about the agricultural impacts of spotted lanternfly as well. Um, this occurred in Pennsylvania. We've been working really closely with Penn State and the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They've really given us a heads up. And because of that, our New York State wine and grape industry is concerned about spotted lanternfly. It's an important part of our agriculture economy in New York State with over 470 wineries. And with the tourism, it has a big annual economic impact. So definitely something we want to protect from this. So this is what happens. Spotted lanternfly, it's mostly feeding on trees. Late in the season, the grapevines look pretty attractive to it. Comes in, it's not feeding on the fruit, it is feeding on the vine. So this insect, as we'll take a look at later, taps into the pipework of the plants. It's in there in the xylem and phloem and removing the sap. And when it does that late in the season, it has an impact on the health of the vines. And this is a vineyard that was killed from unchecked feeding that took place late in the season after harvest at a vineyard in Pennsylvania. So this was taken the following year. The vines just did not come back. And we've learned a lot in this area of Pennsylvania where they stopped planting grapes because of the tremendous populations of spotted lanternfly, and we weren't sure about the management. They have now, over the last 2 or 3 years, begun to replant. We feel like we have enough information to be able to adequately control spotted lanternfly, and the populations have reduced. It seems the first 2 or 3 years, the population really builds and is very high, and then it tapers off and planes out afterwards. In New York State, the first spotted lanternfly on a grapevine in a vineyard occurred in the lower Hudson Valley, and that was in October of 2022. The populations are still not high there yet, but we're closely watching that for this year because this can occur. So I mentioned that the population's reduced. This is also from the eastern part of Pennsylvania. And with that population fluctuations, you can see something like this. You can imagine that this sap feeder is removing enough sugars that the roots and the trunk itself of this grapevine has reduced starches and sugars, and that's so important. It's kind of like the antifreeze for these plants to be able to overwinter. And that's really what kills the grapevines. So let's talk about, so we know it feeds on grapes. What other plants does it feed on? We'll show the life cycle and take a look at the nymphs, but here are some of those nymphs. And this is on cucumbers. And this was sent to us from Staten Island, and it can be a challenge in some of the areas. We've heard reports from parts of Pennsylvania and other areas where cucumbers have been affected by those nymphs. These are the form of the insect that is immature and they don't fly. And they came up with a creative solution on this urban farm on Staten Island to manage it. And we got a little video here. So they, in that situation, were able to use a handheld vacuum and remove the spotted lanternfly from this edible food crop. This is actually okra that they're growing there. So it's pretty close to harvest. Didn't want to use pesticide there. So in that situation, the vacuuming was practical. All right, but I mentioned this before, spotted lanternfly can feed on all of those different species, but really likes tree of heaven. And you all are probably familiar with this species, but just a couple reminders, the leaves can be 3 feet long. That's a yardstick there with that leaf on the left-hand side, the upper left. And one way to distinguish this from something like a black walnut or other pinnately compound leaf is at the base of the leaflets. You can see these lobes, and that is distinct for the tree of heaven or Ailanthus species. You don't see that in other pinnately compound leaves that it might be confused with. When I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, when someone said, well, you didn't mention the scent. And that is sometimes an important characteristic too. If you crush those leaves and smell the leaves there in your hand, it has a distinct odor. Some people equate it to peanut butter. It's kind of sharp, not very pleasant, but that is another identifying feature for the tree of heaven. And when it has access to the tree of heaven, it can lay 7 times the number of eggs. This is just some recent research over the last few years, and it begins laying eggs earlier. So that's important too, because it does not begin laying eggs in Pennsylvania and in New York until the last week of September. So if that can be delayed because it doesn't have access to the Ailanthus or tree of heaven, then it might push it out into October, later in October, and then killing freeze might control the spotted lanternfly before it has a chance to lay eggs. So spotted lanternfly really has this relationship with the tree of heaven. So just a few shots that I took around New York State with Tree of Heaven. This actually was in New York City. I was under this tree, and it felt like rain because there are so many spotted lanternfly up above. They were exuding their honeydew. Those little drops were hitting me just in the couple minutes that I was there in Brooklyn taking that photo. And of course, the seed heads are male and female trees. You can see the seed heads here on the images on the right and left. And those are persistent. So even in the winter, the tree of heaven can stick out in the landscape because the female trees will have those seed heads. Yeah, this is an important thing, and many of you probably are aware of this, but cutting down a tree of heaven will not kill it. In fact, it will come back with a vengeance from the trunk and from those surface roots. And this is candy for the spotted lanternfly nymphs that you can see there on the right-hand side. So if you want to move it, just remove the tree of heaven. Just know that it's not a simple process. It's not as simple as just cutting down the tree. And often herbicides are required because, just as this picture indicates, it can come up from those roots and from the trunk. So one of the methods that works pretty well, and there are products that are labeled to use in this way, is the hack and squirt technique, where we're cutting into the vascular tissue, exposing that directly during the growing season when the tree is actively moving, um, its sugar is down to the roots. The herbicide can follow that pathway and kill the roots, kill the entire tree before it is cut down. Of course, if you do this, in an area where there is um, targets around, walkways, paths, you want to remove that tree so it doesn't become a hazard. But we have people doing that. Some people are taking that on near vineyards, but it doesn't mean that you won't have spotted lanternfly in the area, even if you control all of your ailanthus trees, because as I mentioned before, this insect does it does move around. All right. So let's take a look at what this means. So this is what it means for ailanthus, and yeah, really likes that. We might want to remove our ailanthus, but what about our hardwood trees? Fortunately, Kelly Hoover, a entomologist who works with forestry at Penn State in Pennsylvania, has done some research with spotted lanternfly, and this just came out last year. Um, and yeah, I have that quote there. We would not expect negative impacts of unconfined spotted lanternfly, it's a scientific name there, in natural settings or uh, on forest or ornamental trees. So she did some tests where they caged the spotted lanternfly, didn't give them a choice. They fed on some hardwoods just to see what the impact would be and to get some overall numbers, because as I mentioned, they just keep moving around. But even with those confined spotted lanternfly feeding on the trees, there wasn't a big impact. And we're consistently seeing that even on trees. I'll show you an image later where the trees have been heavily fed upon. They come back the next spring. Yes, they're reduced sugars. Possibly there's a lower growth rate, but there's no implications to the overall health of that tree. And here are some images from Kelly Hoover's work. And we can see silver maple, birch, and willow over 4 seasons. And take a look at these little specks. So this insect is feeding in there. It's putting its proboscis in there. And like a needle, it's tapped in there. It's using that as a straw and sucking out the sap. And each of these are feeding sites, each of those little dots that you're seeing there. So you can see the impact. If the bark wasn't removed here for this photo, you wouldn't be able to see that. But um, and generally, we're not seeing any secondary fungi so far. We're not seeing any secondary disease from this feeding. It is really hidden, but there is reduced sugars and starches in those trees. Um, yeah. So let's take a look at what's going on while it's feeding and what it looks like through the year. So right now they're just beginning to hatch. In mid-May is when we expect them to hatch in most of Pennsylvania. In parts of New York, a little further north where I'm at in upstate New York, probably by the end of the month, we'll expect them to hatch. They began hatching in downstate New York City in about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And in North Carolina, where they have a population, they hatched in by mid-April. So they are dependent on heat, and they're not going to come out before they have an active tree to feed on. So when the leaves are on, when that sap starts moving, um, they begin to hatch so they can have vegetation to feed upon. The young ones don't feed immediately on trees. They're mostly going to feed on the succulent tissue, plants that are lower to the ground, brambles, anything that is green. You can see they develop this red color that shows up in July. Generally, it's around mid-July when we see the adults emerge. And they are out and with us up until December. Whenever that first freeze is in an area where they live, that's what will kill them. A light frost, they can survive, but a hard freeze does kill them. And as I mentioned, the eggs are very resilient and can survive sub-zero temperatures. Here's a close-up of those egg masses. I like this shot because you can see the individual eggs here that are laid in a line and the putty-like material that the female covers her eggs up with. She doesn't always get them all, and these can survive even um, uncovered, but they're more vulnerable that way. So most of the eggs do get covered up. Here's a real concern for movement. They can lay their eggs on anything. I showed the image earlier with them on firewood, but look at this. This camp chair was outside. They lay on the underside of whatever target they find. So this camp chair was leaned up against the tree for this photo. But on the underside of that camp chair, they laid their egg masses there. So if that chair was moved to a part of the country that doesn't have spotted lanternfly, you could have an instant population if they're able to hatch the following spring. And as I mentioned, each of these egg masses have about 35 eggs in them. So tremendous number could be moved. And we're uh, pretty sure that that's happened in the first population that showed up in Indiana. A horse farm moved from Pennsylvania to Indiana. Probably didn't realize that they had it on these egg masses on some of their equipment. Uh, a year or so later, they noticed spotted lanternfly in the area, and it's likely that that was the cause. So something to watch out for. The egg masses there. Here is a view. I happen to be in Pennsylvania to catch the egg mass is hatching, and you can see the individual spotted lanternfly there. And a close-up. They first come out as white, they turn to gray within hours, and then this jet black color with the white spots, very unlike the adult spotted lanternfly. Just another shot. It does develop the red coloration with its fourth instar. And then in mid-July, a slit develops right along this suture line here, and out crawls the adult spotted lanternfly. The wings elongate, and then we have those very recognizable, about an inch long insects that are with us from the late summer through the fall. And here you can see, like this photo, because this tree has blackened bark from the sooty mold. So that's something to look for if you're not sure if spotted lanternfly is in an area. That material that is covering the honeydew that is exuded by the spotted lanternfly. And it's pretty easy to see these spotted lanternfly here. And it's an insect that has black spots. It's polka dotted. So you'd think, yeah, I'm going to recognize that if I see it in my area. But it's amazingly camouflaged. I took this photo on a red maple tree. And can you see the spotted lanternfly there? This arrow helps out. So there are four of them, at least in that photo. Um, and yeah, surprising. Something that's helped me is to look for a protrusion, something sticking out of the side of the tree, something three-dimensional, because they are so large. Sometimes I'll see that before I recognize their color. So if we take one of those insects and flip it over, this is what we're looking at. It is a spotted lanternfly with the proboscis clearly visible here. And this is like a sheath. This helps the spotted lanternfly get through the bark and get to that xylem and phloem. And it has nerve endings here where it can get right into that sweet spot, moving really between the xylem and the phloem to where it wants to feed. It relies some, we believe, on the water pressure from within the tree, and then it begins pumping out a sap. And it's a copious amount of sap that it feeds on. And the waste product, that honeydew, comes out this end. It's excreted there. and it's just highlighting that really important part of this insect when it's feeding. So this was provided to us by Penn State. It was taken a couple of years ago. Really like this image though, because we're going to be able to see spotted lanternfly feeding here. I like to point out that it's not feeding on the grapes, not feeding on the leaves. You can see a little bit of honeydew here on the leaves, but it is into the stems. And do you see this right here? That's honeydew being forced out of that insect. So it's filtered out what it needs, and then that honeydew is expelled. And that can accumulate, as I showed before, on tree trunks or whatever is below. Occasionally, you can see a tree like this. This was in a residential situation, and the branches were hanging over the back steps. This step was cleared with a power washer, so you could see how it should look. It had a coating of honeydew that quickly the sooty mold grew on top of. So that's a fungus that likes to feed on honeydew. We can see that with some of our native insects. But here it is with spotted lanternfly. That honeydew is also attractive, in addition to sooty mold, to honeybees and yellow jackets, especially late in the season when those large spotted lanternfly are producing all of that honeydew. They're sometimes getting their nectar from spotted lanternfly rather than from fall flowering plants. So we actually can have some concerns about bee stings in areas where there are more spotted lanternfly. Actually, some Department of Transportation workers have had some problems with that along roadways where there's a lot of spotted lanternfly. And there is in some cases, honey develops an off flavor because the honeybees are going to spotted lanternfly instead of those flowers. I think the beekeepers have now developed a protocol where they allow that honey to be in there to be used for the winter for the bees. And generally, they're not selling that honey, although there are some beekeepers that offer special spotted lanternfly honey for the adventurous. I've tasted it. I'd say it has an earthy flavor and not something I'd have on my morning toast. You can see the tree on the left. This sometimes does show up where they choose a tree and they all gather there. This is in the fall, but it was occurring a little bit earlier. This happens to be in Pennsylvania, where my brother lives, and that's his truck in the background. He was noticing some spotting, some of that honeydew in his truck a few weeks before he took this photo. But there you can see large numbers of spotted lanternfly. And I show this for a couple reasons. One is, yeah, it can look dramatic. That tree, that was a silver maple. It's just fine. No impacts that are visible. This was taken 2 years ago. The following spring looked completely unharmed, and it looks great right now. So I wanted to bring that out. Also, I wanted to let you know that, this can look pretty dramatic. My sister-in-law put this on Facebook, the image on the right there. I think both of these images. And, there was a lot of advice, a lot of it that we don't recommend. Even a blowtorch, please, no, don't do that. But yeah, people feel strongly about this insect, and there's some misattribution there. It's not killing the blue spruce. Um, as a matter of fact, conifers are not impacted at all by spotted lanternfly. So important to know. We also, because of that reaction that spotted lanternfly elicits, we like to remind people that these insects don't bite, they don't sting, they don't survive indoors. We actually did some research with a student intern, brought them indoors at room temperature without feeding. they could only survive for about 48 hours before they die. So it's not like stink bugs or other insects that we'll have to live with inside. These guys aren't going to be that kind of problem. And they're not harming landscape trees for those homeowners that are concerned, unless, there is a caveat. I should probably have that in there. Unless your landscape includes tree of heaven. And that happens. People allow those seedlings to come up and they can become an important part of the landscape. So tree of heaven can be impacted. We can see yellowing in the foliage of tree of heaven, and even death when there's a lot of ailanthus around. It can kill a tree of heaven. So what can we do to manage these insects, and what kind of other information is out there? Well, Penn State has some great resources. Some other states do as well. At New York State, we have our spotted lanternfly web pages where we've collected a lot of information, and that includes management information that you can see here. You can click on that, and you can get to some of the tools that are out there. There are traps that can be used. Right now, there's no known um, attractant for spotted lanternfly. There's no pheromones that we can use yet as a tool. So it's basically intercepting the spotted lanternfly as they're climbing up trees. Um, and we do have here information on sticky bands, but let's talk about those traps for a second. So here is the circle trap. It's one of the most common, and it's a very effective trap. It encircles the tree. It's basically like an inverted funnel. The spotted lanternfly that climb up, and I'll mention they continually climb up during the growing season. They'll be feeding on a tree. They'll launch to themselves. They'll fly, but they're not strong flyers. They eventually reach the ground, and then they look around. It seems like they like to choose the tallest tree in the area, and they will begin climbing up, but not always. I mean, you can put it on a smaller tree as well, and you'll intercept some. So they work their way up and they get into this plastic bag. Sometimes there's plastic jars that are used, and you can see that they're in there. Sometimes in an area that has a lot of spotted lanternfly, these bags fill up within 4 or 5 days. Um, this was in the Bronx, New York. We were doing a demo there. I put this up, and within an hour, we had 3 spotted lanternfly in there. There's also different types of sticky traps. This is one called Bug Barrier, and it has its adhesive material on the inside. So the outside is not sticky at all, and it's held away from the trunk with this poly fill type material. And so my hand is in there, so you can see the insect would crawl up there, reach this barrier, and then crawl out onto the sticky material. Can also use the traditional sticky bands, but as in this photo, you want to protect it because I have images. I'm sparing you of those today of woodpeckers, particularly, that got caught on these sticky bands because, hey, there's a free meal here. Look at all these insects, and they unfortunately can get stuck. So we're only recommending that the sticky bands be used with some kind of barrier. And it can be something as simple as a screening material that, this fiberglass material can get out of hardware. You can just use thumbtacks and put that above the adhesive band. And again, another shot of that bug barrier where it prevents bycatch by keeping the sticky material on the inside. And there are insecticides that are available to use. And actually, this insect is not difficult to manage with insecticides. Many classes of insecticides will kill it. But you have to use products that are labeled. We specifically have products here that are labeled for New York. New York tends to be more stringent than many other states. So likely if it's available in New York, it is available in your state as well, but always check the label and the local registrations. But we have management specifically in commercial settings for grapes, and then products labeled for residential use, and that is both by commercial applicators and homeowners as well, private applicators. So they're all in that same table. And there's a lot of research that's taking place on spotted lanternfly, a lot of work in getting the information out there through Cornell Extension and Master Gardeners, our New York State IPM program with the different commodities that we work with. The entomology department at Cornell is working on biocontrol. It's been pretty active over the last few years, the pesticide education management. And we really work closely with the Northeastern IPM, and they're coordinating some of this outreach effort for the region. Done some field surveys, outreach work. In this shot to the right, we can see we're training the field workers to be able to recognize spotted lanternfly. We really want to catch it early in some of these areas, and our New York State Ag and Markets is doing some remediation work when they detect a new outlying population. And yeah, there's some hope for the future. Take a look at this. There's fungi that are out there that feed upon and kill spotted lanternfly before they have a chance to lay egg masses. That's Eric Clifton here, there, a postdoc who was doing work on looking at these entomopathic fungi that are occurring just naturally out there, isolating some of these, growing them in a lab, and seeing if this could be a potential treatment, a natural treatment in the future. And there is some promise. They also were looking like, okay, if we spray this out there, is it going to kill a lot of our other native insects? Because we don't want that to happen. And from that field test that they did, it looks really good that only the spotted lanternfly, with very few exceptions, was killed there. So, but it's not perfect. You know, these fungi that feed on insects do require high humidity to develop. So research is still underway. It's not a cure-all. There are two of the fungi that they're looking at. They also, in fact, Eric there found a brand new fungus, new to science, that feeds on spotted lanternfly. Pretty impressive three-dimensional look to that fungus, right? In addition to fungi, other things are finding out that spotted lanternfly could be a food source, and that includes bird predators. We're hearing about backyard chickens, cardinals, catbirds, blue jays, tufted titmice. These birds will feed on spotted lanternfly to some degree, and this was all done through a citizen science project where people submitted photos when they saw something feeding on a spotted lanternfly to a graduate student at Penn State. So they established this list so that in addition to birds, there are other insects that feed on spotted lanternfly, and that includes praying mantis, yellow jackets, spiders, not just the orb weaver, but other spiders and wheel bugs. I got to say that we're definitely seeing more wheel bugs in areas that have spotted lanternfly, and maybe even ants are feeding on them. But the number one most reported is praying mantis. And I think that's because they're up on branches, they're in foliage, they're very visible. Some of these other insects are feeding on spotted lanternfly out of the way where we're not seeing that happening. And this might be at least partially responsible for the drop in population we see after a couple of years. You know, nature does not ignore a food source, and these insects and birds are starting to take advantage of that in some areas, and we think that might be helping to reduce the population. The citizen science project I mentioned looked at all kinds of predators, including fish that would feed on spotted lanternfly. And some of this, you know, this is an aquarium fish. So somebody was feeding spotted lanternfly to their African cichlids. But some of those outdoors you might see happening. And reptiles and amphibians, frogs, toads, even snakes will feed on spotted lanternfly, have a diverse diet there. And then, yeah, mammals. And some of these are domestic animals. So the dogs and cats, and they don't always keep the spotted lanternfly down because it can be an irritant. We don't know of any toxin in spotted lanternfly at this point, but the irritant, you know how dogs and cats might be, it might not stay down. And yeah, this is kind of funny. Yes, they can put anything in their mouth. Um, Yeah. So I just like to thank all the people that we collaborate to bring this information to you. It's been great working with everybody on the team, and we have plans for a lot more research coming up in the next couple of years. So really happy to talk to you and take some questions that you might have.
Brian, thank you. That was great. So, for the audience, this is when you can start typing questions in. I'm going to start. Oh, I love the toddler one. That was just like too funny. Um, I mean, it's great that so I have two kind of questions. One is on the things that the prey, spotted lanternfly. I mean, it's nice that there's such a diversity of prey on spotted lanternfly because, and I don't know anything about praying mantis or the wheel bugs, but I'm guessing that their daily consumption of spotted lantern flies is measured in singles or maybe tens,
Right.
praying. So we need lots of these.
Yeah.
Is that okay? So that's great.
That's right. And I think there is some evidence that the population of praying mantis and wheel bugs has increased with this new food source, but nobody's taking a census of those insects. So yeah, you're right. I mean, you see the huge numbers that are there on the trunk, and if we could look up in those tree canopies, we would see probably double those amounts there. So yeah, it's a big task, and that predation is probably just one of the ways that this will be kept in check in the future.
Sure. Then the second question, just for the maple producers that are here, I just want to clarify, it doesn't sound like there's, from a maple production perspective,
Yeah.
this is not going to be at this point, who knows what's going to happen, but at this point, it doesn't look like spotted lanternfly is going to be a significant impact on the maple industry.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. A couple of points I would like to make that I haven't yet made, and sorry about that. But one, if we look in a forest setting, it is mostly going to be along the edges, along those margins where the populations of spotted lanternfly will be the highest. For whatever reason, they tend not to show up in the middle of a woodland. So that's good because our sugar bush is spread throughout the forested situations and not just along the edge. Second, among the trees that they like, they will feed on all maple species, but they really like red maple and silver maple over the sugar maple. So sugar maple will have fewer spotted lanternfly, and it's more of a last resort if they don't have access to those other maples or their other favorite hosts, but they will feed on sugar maple. So the question is still out there on what kind of impact this could have to a sugar maple harvest because you saw that they're feeding on the sap, which is exactly what we want to harvest the following spring. So if there's a lot of spotted lanternfly in an area that has a lot of sugar maple, you know, we're not anticipating a big problem with that, but it really is an unanswered question, and there is some effort to start looking at research um, on that, and then what kind of management would be appropriate in a setting where you want to protect your sugar maple. But right now, we're hoping that it won't be an issue, but it's something that is being looked at.
Okay, very good. So there are several questions coming in. Do you want me to read them for you, or do
If
you
you
want to?
wouldn't mind,
Okay,
yeah, going down because I'm
sure,
just seeing a small view of the chat and I don't want to miss anything.
sure. So one I did see You may want to go back to your earlier slide. There's a question about the Connecticut map. So while you're
Oh,
doing that,
okay.
I'll find the first question. Um, so it looks like a lot of Connecticut has evidence of.
Yeah, yeah. So there it is. And I will mention that the smallest unit we use for this map is the county level. Some of these counties just have one spot where there's a breeding population of spotted lanternfly, and most of the county does not have spotted lanternfly yet, but the entire county gets colored in just for purposes of this map.
Okay.
And some of the states, if you go to the Department of Agriculture's websites, they will show a more detailed map with, um, the areas that are infested.
Okay. So you'd showed a picture of the feeding. So you had sliced away the bark and
Mm
showed just
-hmm.
that was, I mean, I'm assuming that was done specifically to show the feeding wounds. Is that
That is correct. That was
okay?
to show the feeding wounds, and that was in a research setting where those were caged trees, and so they knew that that was spotted lanternfly that did that. They saw them in that area. They removed the bark and then saw where the spotted lanternfly was probing, and the tree's response to that with the pigments in there.
Okay. Okay, let's see. So Rebecca wants to know, are the circle traps that you showed that has the like clear shell and then the sticky is on the inside, are those effective against other pests or
Yeah, the circle traps were not developed for spotted lanternfly. They were used for other, I think, some agricultural pests. And I should mention they're mostly used for monitoring. It's not, going to control enough to make a difference in population, but for a backyard management technique, it's a great way to go. People can remove a lot of spotted lanternfly in that setting, but they'll still be around in the area.
okay?
And so this one doesn't have any sticky material. It's just relying on the spotted lanternfly to crawl up there and just get caught in the trap and stay in there.
Yeah. Okay. I forget the name of oh, there it is. Celia wants to know, how do you properly clean equipment and materials that you are suspicious might have been contaminated with eggs?
Good question. And we're hoping that people will do that. They're pretty, when you start to look for them, they're pretty easy to see. I mean, they can look just like a speck of mud but they're about 2 inches long, about an inch wide. So they're quite visible. And then if you just scrape them off, and I didn't mention this, but they can be easily scraped off. And if they can be put in a bag, and that bag can be disposed of. That's one way to handle it. They can also be squished like with a hammer so that the eggs are destroyed, depending on what they're on. But scraping them off with something like a credit card is a pretty good way to go about that.
But they need to be collected. You shouldn't just scrape them off onto the
You
ground.
should not just scrape them. You should
Okay.
just not scrape them onto the ground because those eggs would still be viable.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of them would be fed upon by insects on the ground, but you don't want to chance it. You do
Right.
want to control them. In some places, they're recommending putting like hand sanitizer there. The alcohol and the hand sanitizer in a bag that you're scraping them into will kill the
Hmm.
spider fly.
Huh. That's good to know. Okay. Elizabeth asks how we should be treating Tree of Heaven, if we should be cutting it down.
Mm.
And I've posted. So Penn State has a great handout. I don't know, jump in front of Brian, but I'll offer a comment and then Brian can add to it if he likes.
Yeah,
The
go ahead. Go ahead, Peter.
Penn State has some great fact sheets on managing Tree of Heaven. Dave Jackson wrote those. They specifically recommend not cutting the trees because if you cut them, as Brian mentioned, they just sprout from the stump and sprout from the roots. So look at the link that I've posted. I just reposted it into the chat window. There's a seasonal window that's particularly effective. And like Brian had mentioned, a hack and squirt or a drill and fill technique is going to be the most effective way to control Tree of Heaven.
Yeah, and the question is like if you're in an area that doesn't have spotted lanternfly, should you preemptively cut down your tree of heaven? I think, that's such a big task that it's probably not practical because of the places where this weed species shows up. And, we don't have access to the rail corridors. They're very sensitive about having anybody there other than a railway employee. So it sounds good, but it's probably not going to be practical. And as I mentioned before, even if you cut down all the ailanthus on your property, these insects fly around, and late in the season, they go to the plants that they want to go to.
Okay, William Schroeder wants to know, does spotted lanternfly stress landscape trees, which may cause other insects or other vectors to cause more damage?
Yeah, great question because we see that with other insects, the beech bark disease and the fungi that are the scale and the beech bark disease and other insects can stress them. We haven't seen that association yet. There was one setting where there was a lot of feeding, that group feeding on branches of a red maple, and a couple branches showed a little bit of dieback that seemed to be associated with spotted lanternfly in a landscape situation. But that was just an isolated incident, and they're not seeing that consistently in areas of Pennsylvania that have a lot of spotted lanternfly. But good question, and probably something for us all to watch for.
Okay. Gary notes that Korea has been dealing with this, and he wants to know if they have found any management strategies that are showing effectiveness.
Yeah, early on, I say we, but the researchers that were looking at this visited there, and they're also looking for like what insects are feeding on spotted lanternfly in those locations and in its native habitat. And I'll mention they brought some of those insects back. They're in isolation labs at the USDA, making sure that these insects will not feed on any of our native insects. They had two really good potential candidates. One, however, had too big of a host range. There's another parasite uh, insect, parasitoid, that looks like it has promise. Of course, it'll be a few years before they'll be able to release that. But that's another insect that we have hope for the future. I think they were seeing a little bit of different type of feeding in South Korea. They also saw them on fruit trees. We will occasionally see them on apples and other fruit trees, but they don't stay very long. So they're not causing any impact to our orchardists in the Northeast.
Okay. Uh, the Boseys from Ellicottville would like to know how many vegetable varieties are impacted by spotted lanternfly.
Well, I would say they could feed on nearly every kind of vegetable, but um, the one that we're seeing damage on is the cucumbers. So maybe some other members of that family, so maybe squash and cantaloupe would be something to watch for. But right now, it looks like cucumber is the one that is a favorite of those spotted lanternfly nymphs.
Lindsay wants to know what's the lowest temperature the eggs can withstand.
Good question. It is, I'm trying to recall that research, but I just know it is sub-zero temperatures and it's temperatures that are so low that we don't see them in New York State over the winter. So they're just really resilient. That being said, there are parts of the Northeast that we don't expect spotted lanternfly to be able to survive because they need that really long growing season. I mentioned the eggs haven't hatched here in upstate New York. And if you were to go to an area like the Adirondacks, it would be weeks until the temperature would be warm enough for the eggs to hatch. And then with them not being able to lay eggs until September here, that might be delayed further and you could have a killing frost. So there are parts of the country, most of the state of Maine, we don't expect spotted lanternfly to be able to survive because it needs that really long growing season. But the eggs, yeah, they're going to survive really cold temperatures. Oh, and we had somebody I just saw chat at least um, minus 20 degrees Celsius for the eggs. Thank you for that bit there coming through in the chat.
Yeah, that's cold.
Yes.
Okay. Is anyone, is there any research being done on the um, component of Tree of Heaven that's an attractant?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
thinking about using that in a trapping as a as a pheromone or a lure in a trap situation.
Good question. And not only might it be an attractant, but it seems like there are some alkaloids, these phytochemicals in the tree of heaven that accumulate in the spotted lanternfly, and that might provide some deterrent for some predators to feed upon it. And generally, like a monarch butterfly that looks pretty flashy, like the red color we see in the underwings, that could be a deterrent to other insects feeding on it. Still, there's research going on way to look at that and what those chemicals are. And then, yeah, could there be an attractant? We did a study last year that was initiated by Brian Walsh at Penn State, who's been working on spotted lanternfly for years. And we put chipped Atlantis. It's a really simple study. Chipped up Atlantis in mesh bags on posts, on some posts and not on others to see if spotted lanternfly would be attracted to the trap and get caught in the traps on those posts. And we found a slight attractant to it. Unfortunately, we did it in an area that had a lot of Atlantis nearby, and I think that could have confused the insect. So we want to try that again in an area that doesn't have that. But it is a good question because there's something that's bringing them together, and research is still underway to figure out what that is.
Okay.
And it looks
So,
like um, even at an hour at negative 25 C that they can survive. So got some researchers from
yeah,
Canada that are
yeah,
looking at that.
good. Um, so what are so you mentioned insecticides, landowner insecticides, and then vineyard insecticides. What are I'm a certified applicator, but I don't know if I've ever used an insecticide. What are can you give kind of a broad brush? How are they? So somebody wants to know if there's an aerial treatment. You could fly over an area. Maybe that would work, but are these spray to contact? You spray trees and then it repels it, kind of like insect repellent on a human? What's the nature of treatment using
I would
insecticides?
say, yeah, all different kinds. So yes to a lot of that, although I don't know of any repellent. So one thing that's really interesting, yeah, there are the contact ones, and as I mentioned, the spotted lanternfly is pretty susceptible to many classes of insecticides. One treatment that really has gained some ground in it is a systemic treatment with a product, an active ingredient called dinotefuran. There
Hmm.
are some other systemics as well. These can be applied to an ailanthus tree and taken up systemically. Then when the spotted lanternfly feed on it, they die and they fall to the ground. I've been at some sites where they've had those trees, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of spotted lanternfly at the base of those trees. And so some people are trying to use this as a trap tree technique where they make those treatments. They leave Atlantis there for that purpose, just keeping the males and not the females, because the females are going to be shedding seeds each year. And that's one approach to management in an area. There's a little concern, of course, with the neonicotinoids that dinotefuran is that it could affect pollinators, and pollinators will visit Atlantis flowers. So the timing of that is important. We want to do it after the Atlantis has flowered.
Okay. Mark wants to know, what do commercial vehicles need to do that are traveling in and out of quarantine areas? So the first question, are there quarantine areas of New York related to spotted lanternfly?
There
And
is
then,
not.
okay,
New York has not gone that route. But at this map, whoops, here we can see the red areas indicate quarantined areas. And uh, if you're commercial, if you're moving material, anything commercially, your company has to have had training. Somebody at that company has to have gone through the online training. And this is through the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and Penn State. They created this online training, and it's good. There is a test, and then you get a certificate for your business, and then it's a responsibility of that point person at that business to train the drivers that are out there. And what they have to do is inspect their vehicles before they leave the quarantined zone. And that includes if you're even driving through a quarantine zone and you're staying longer than an hour. So I'd have to look at the regulations. You need to reinspect your vehicle for spotted lanternfly. And they can get into cabs of the vehicle. So, they can land on us and we don't know it and follow us into the vehicle. So, something to watch for.
no shortage of tricks they have up their sleeve.
Yeah.
So I think we've hit all the questions. So and those were great questions. And for any of the Canadian scientists that are still here, thanks for chiming in with your experiences about what
Yeah.
you've
I
seen with
appreciate that too.
eggs hatching after an hour at negative 25 C. So
I
that's a
know, I know they're concerned in Canada too. Um, and as well is the Western United States, with California, Oregon, and Washington with their grape industries there.
mhm, sure. All right. Well, Brian, thank you. Audience, thank you. We've kept 100 people engaged here. So we had 148, I think, at the peak. But this is very useful, and I appreciate it. Appreciate your willingness to schedule this and share all that you've learned and what other people are learning too. So Brian will be back at 7 p.m. I'll be back at 7 p.m. and we'll work through this again.
All
And
right.
if you all want to come back and see it again, you can. You're welcome. So, all
Yeah.
right, Brian,
All right.
thank you so much. See you in a
Thank
few
you, Peter.
hours.